Well, I realized once I got here in November and had my first Sunday on the chancel that this church was built for very big people. The first Sunday I went to sit in the chair that Tom is sitting in, I went to lean back and it just kept going. I felt like those of you who are older may remember Lily Tomlin. When she sits in the huge chair, was that Edith Ann or something? Yes, I have felt like that. So today really gave us a challenge to try to figure out how you all were going to be able to see me preach and not just have me be a voice from down here somewhere. So Leo built me, our facilities manager, built me what can only be described as a giant step. So it is quite a feat, and after church, you probably want to come see it because I doubt you've ever seen anything like it before. Well, we find ourselves today in the time between Christmas and New Year's. Christmastide is what the liturgical calendar calls this liminal time between our celebration of the birth of Christ on Christmas Day and the coming of the wise ones on Epiphany. If we are fortunate, it is a restful time where we continue to enjoy the beauty of Christmas for a few more days. It was during Christmastide many years ago that I found myself unable to sit back and enjoy these days. I was in my first unit of a pastoral education program at a hospital in Washington, D.C. My fall had been unbelievably busy. I was back in school full-time. I was working part-time as a director of a spiritual care program at a hospital closer to home, and I was commuting several days a week, 50 miles in 3 different directions. One would have thought I lived in LA. Because of this schedule, I found myself at the end of the year with many, many clinical hours that needed to be logged by December 31st. So in their kindness, the director of the chaplain's office and my colleagues allowed me to take all of their hours between Christmas and New Year's. And that was such a gift. Every morning that week, I made that 50-mile trek from our home in Northern Virginia to the hospital in Washington. I was usually there a little before 7 and out a little after 7 p.m. A typical hospital schedule for those of you who work there. But in a hospital that is not a trauma center and in a facility where most procedures are elective, I was afraid the days were going to be very long and very boring because nothing would be happening. Every patient that could be sent home was home. I was dreading those days. And yet, as often happens, in liminal time, God shows up in ways we could not have imagined. One of my first visits that week was to a man who was dying of leukemia. The charge nurse asked if I would stop in to see him, explaining what a dear, sweet person he was. She did not tell me he was a Catholic priest. His eyes were closed when I first stopped by, so I stood in the doorway for a moment, and deciding to come back later, I turned to leave until I heard a gentle voice say, "Were you coming to see me?" In that first visit, he explained to me that he was a Catholic priest, part of an order of brothers who lived together in a monastery in the city. He had been part of that order for almost 50 years and had in many ways been continuing to live for all of them more than for himself. Continuing to live at that point meant continual blood transfusions, and he had made the decision on Christmas Eve to stop the treatment. His brothers at the monastery could not understand or support his decision, and he felt very alone for the first time in his life. So over those next few days, I spent much of my time in a chair by the side of a bed, listening to a man whose faith had shaped his entire life. I became his student, and together we spoke of faith and theology and doctrine and belief and unbelief. He wanted to know what I was reading, and so I shared all of my thoughts and my theories and hopes and dreams as I was reaching towards seminary and ordination. He wasn't afraid of telling me when he thought I was wrong, and somewhere along the way, our conversations began to center around the afterlife and what he did and did not believe. He was light years ahead of me, and somehow the light was becoming so much brighter for him. And the rays of that light, those rays were falling on me. I went home every evening with my mind filled with the grace and the love his years as a priest had brought to him and were now bringing to me. When I went to his room on New Year's Eve, he had news and 2 requests. He was going to his sister's house with hospice to live out his few remaining days. His first request was that I would come and visit him at his sister's. It was so hard to explain that I could not fulfill that request. Hospital policies did not allow us to continue a relationship with a patient after they left the facility. It was a boundary that was strictly enforced no matter what the circumstances. His second request took my breath away. He simply asked if I would hear his last confession. I was at the time an ordained Baptist and a woman, not Catholic, not a priest, not even a nun, and he wanted me to hear his confession. It took me a few moments, but slowly I felt the tables turning as I began to wonder if the teacher was becoming the student and the student was becoming the teacher. I had to ask him to explain the process to me since I had never even made a confession, much less heard a confession. He gently took me through the steps, explaining what he needed. And so I listened in those moments to his life review, the good, the bad, the regrets, the gratitudes, the hopes, the dreams, and the desire now for peace and forgiveness. It was a holy moment. A thin place, as the Celts say, a place where heaven and earth seemed to merge. Perhaps it was that kind of day when Jesus stayed at the temple when his parents began the journey home. The scripture doesn't really tell us why Jesus remained behind. We don't know what was going through his mind or his heart. The story simply tells us Jesus stayed in the temple. The picture you have on the front of your program, take it out for a minute and look at it. I think it so beautifully captures this holy moment, this thin place. Jesus sitting at the feet of the teachers, listening, wondering, absorbing, and the teachers' faces filled with expressions of wonder and of joy. These teachers were the priests, the scholars, the one who knew the scriptures and the laws, the words and the prophets. I wonder where the table turned. I wonder if, in fact, on that day, the teachers at the temple began to realize this one sitting before them was becoming their teacher. Teachers in our lives come in all shapes and sizes. They are young and old. They are brilliant and simple. And yet, if we are ready, if we are open to all there is to learn, the teachers will appear. We may not realize their impact at the time. It may be years before we fully understand the difference they made in our lives. I carried the experience with the priest in my heart for a long time. I'm not sure I ever spoke of them, but when I began to write the sermon for today, those days of Christmastide, those liminal days, those memories of a man who spent his final days pouring his lifeblood into me, came flooding back into my soul and into my spirit. For the first time this week, as I lived with this story once again, I began to see exactly what this precious priest was doing in the final days of his life. He was very aware that Baptist women aren't usually ordained. In fact, he said to me, "I think God has a wonderful sense of humor, because who would have believed that my last confession would be made to a Baptist woman?" In those final days, what he did for me was give me his blessing. I may have been the one to hear his confession, but he was the one that ordained me months before my church would go through the formal process. Who have been the teachers in your life? Who are the people who invested in you, who helped mold and shape you, the ones who encouraged you to be all that you have been created to be, the ones that gave you their blessing? And who are those that sit at your feet today? The ones who watch your words and your actions, listening for encouragement, needing your nurture as they begin to discover who they are and who they will become. All through this season of Advent and Christmas, we have been invited to experience the beauty of this season through art, words, and music. As we prepare for the new year, I hope you will find time to give thanks for all this year has meant to you and to begin to prepare your hearts and minds for the blessing of the new year. May it be so. May it be so for each of us.